24th, a Sunday morning in the wee hours of the morning in Geneva, the foreign ministers of Iran, the U.S., the U.K., China, Russia, France, all gathered together to announce an initial agreement on the Iran nuclear issue. It was only a first step, and it was a very controversial step. There were no guarantees that this first step was going to result in a final comprehensive agreement, but it was a promising first step. And it raised hopes throughout the world that this long-standing dispute that threatened international peace and security could finally be resolved, and resolved peacefully without the use of military force. Since the Obama administration had assumed office in 2009, there had been 4 years of sterile, unproductive talks. But then came the Iranian presidential election of June of this year. And unexpectedly, Hassan Rouhani, the moderate candidate in a rather large field, achieved a majority on the first ballot, and he was elected president of Iran. The elections had made a difference. Before the election, Iran's leaders were in a state of denial about their economic situation. They dismissed the effects of the sanctions, saying that they had faced much worse during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. They said that Iran could find ways of circumventing the sanctions and engaging in normal commercial activities. They predicted that the international community would soon develop sanctions fatigue, and that the international community would stop implementing sanctions in the hope of resuming normal commercial operations with Iran. After his inauguration in August, President Rouhani brought in a team of experienced professionals. Like Rouhani, they are loyal to the Islamic Republic, but they are pragmatic, and they are realists. His foreign minister, Javad Zarif, was educated in the United States and spent much of his professional life in New York, first as a junior officer and then as ambassador, the Islamic Republic's ambassador to the United Nations. When Rouhani's team took office, they took a hard look at Iran's economic conditions, and what they found alarmed them. The situation was much more desperate than the previous leaders were prepared to admit. Crude oil exports were down from 2.5 million barrels per day to less than 1 million barrels per day, which translated into a decline of around 60% in oil revenues. And for an economy that relies so heavily on oil revenues, this was devastating. They also learned that no reputable bank in the world would deal with Iran, and the ability to get financing had a cascading impact throughout their economy. The rial, their currency, came under sanctions and lost most of its value, at one point close to 80%. Inflation was about 40%, and unemployment was also very high, with key industries crippled. The new team also saw that Iran's international standing had suffered greatly in recent years. it had become isolated and widely seen as a pariah. And this was a blow to Iranian national pride. The new team of internationally minded Iranians found Iran's estrangement from the world to be intolerable. The new team recognized that in order to reverse Iran's economic decline and international isolation, a new approach was necessary. They knew that getting the economy back on track required the lifting of sanctions, and they knew that ending Iran's isolation meant engagement, including with the United States, or the Great Satan, as the United States is still often called. With his mandate, Rouhani went to New York in September to the UN General Assembly, and he and his team waged a very active public diplomacy campaign, stressing their moderation and flexibility and their support for constructive negotiations. Their desire was to convey an impression of reasonableness, to convince the world that they were serious about negotiations and that they deserved to be given the benefit of the doubt. In addition to their public campaign, they also engaged diplomatically. Iran and the P5+1 foreign ministers met on the margins of the UN General Assembly, and that provided the opportunity for Secretary of State John Kerry to hold a bilateral one-on-one meeting with Foreign Minister Zarif, the first such encounter since the Islamic Revolution. The next day, President Obama phoned President Rouhani, and they had a good, substantive conversation. Clearly, the ice was breaking. Engagement in New York set the stage for the first post-election round of P5+1 talks with Iran at the political directors level. That's the sub-cabinet level. It took place in Geneva, October 15th and 16th. Zarif was the only foreign minister present. The P5+1 and Iran next convened on November 7th and 8th, again in Geneva. Much substantive progress was made this time, mostly during bilateral talks between the United States and Iran. Secretary Kerry and other foreign ministers suddenly flew into Geneva in the hope of resolving the few remaining issues, and expectations rose dramatically. The text was sent back to the capitals of the P5+1 countries for review. The next day, the French introduced several proposed modifications. But the French proposals, and especially French Foreign Minister Fabius's public criticisms of the text, seemed motivated, at least in part, by resentment that the text was largely worked out by the United States and Iran, with France not playing a sufficient role. In any event, the squabble soon ended, and the P5+1 quickly came to agreement on a revised consensus proposal that incorporated most of the French proposals. However, when the text was presented to the Iranians, they said they couldn't respond without a review in Tehran, and so the round ended without a deal. The P5+1 talks resumed on November 20th, also in Geneva. Although a few issues remained, the negotiations were pretty tough. But with foreign ministers again assembled in Geneva, agreement was finally announced in the early morning hours of November 24th. The agreement took the form of a document entitled Joint Plan of Action. It provided for a 6-month interim agreement, which was labeled the first step. It also outlined the general principles of a final comprehensive agreement. During the 6 months of the first step, when the first step was being implemented, the P5+1 negotiators and Iran would seek to hammer out the details of a final agreement. And the first step agreement contained detailed constraints on Iran's nuclear program, as well as measures to ease sanctions on Iran. Unless Iran continues to face crippling sanctions, it will have little incentive to agree to the measures the P5+1 need for a final deal. I would expect the Obama administration in coming weeks to reach out to governments and companies around the world to remind them that most of the sanctions remain in place and to urge them not to engage prematurely in commercial activity with Iran that could undercut the leverage needed for a sound final agreement. The effectiveness of the international sanctions was what brought Iran to the negotiating table, and the sanctions were clearly instrumental in producing a good interim agreement. Japan and Japanese companies played a critical role in that international sanctions coalition by reducing Japan's purchase of Iranian crude oil and reducing those crude oil purchases at a time of post-Fukushima energy difficulties, also by restricting its financial and commercial ties with Iran, and by joining other members of the coalition in adopting a wide range of measures that helped send a clear signal to Iran that it needed to negotiate seriously. All countries that want to see a diplomatic solution to the Iran nuclear issue rather than a military solution, and I'm sure that includes Japan, should take the steps necessary to ensure that the P5+1 negotiators have the leverage they need to arrive at an effective final agreement. At this time, it's impossible to estimate the probability of reaching a final agreement. A favorable outcome is far from assured. But if the international community sticks together, as it has done in recent years, then we have a reasonable chance of resolving an issue that has threatened for over a decade to undermine the global nonproliferation regime, disrupt the world economy, and jeopardize regional and international security. On definition of success, I think the definition of success is to have an agreement that is verifiable and that keeps Iran a good distance away from the nuclear threshold. Iran knows how to enrich uranium. You can't wipe out that knowledge. But what you can do is limit their enrichment capability such that their so-called breakout timeline is lengthened considerably. And what I mean by breakout timeline is the amount of time it would take them to go from a decision to have nuclear weapons to the actual production of enough fissile material to build a few nuclear weapons. If that timeline is long enough, and if the initiation of breakout is detectable by the IAEA, then it would be a very risky proposition for Iran to break out of constraints, because we would find out about it very soon, and before they could actually build a nuclear weapon, there would be many months of time in which they would be vulnerable militarily. And so I think that is the definition of success: lengthen the breakout timeline and detect any breakout as soon as possible. That's how we're trying to structure an agreement.